Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching and listening to this, everyone. It's me, Simon Gear from Alexander Lloyd, and welcome to Talk HR UK, our regular podcast with fantastic HR leaders. Today, I am once again with a regular on the show, the lovely Gavin Russell. Morning, afternoon, evening, Gavin.
Morning, afternoon, evening.
Thanks for
Happy
joining
Christmas.
us once again. I know it is almost
About
Christmas.
that time.
Right. We should have. There's no decorations in here. Not very festive.
No,
sorry.
not very festive.
But some of you who are used to the show will know Gavin from a couple of sessions we've run before. Gavin is the author of Transformation Timebomb, available through Amazon. Also the founding member of Moth, an online coaching agency, academy, and membership club that enables leaders to master their culture. Thank you for joining us again, Gavin. Tell us a little bit about
Thank you very much for having me. Lovely to be here. I'm sure everyone knows the patter by now, but I've been 25 years within the world of HR and talent. Done lots of different things in that space, but really the last 8 years or so has been exclusively on organizational culture. And that's really as a result of combining a couple of passions of mine. I did a lot of team sport when I was growing up, and then I've coached a lot of sport recently. And I thought, well, how can I combine my twin loves of coaching and teamwork? And it's come out in this culture work. So that's kind of why I'm here.
Fantastic. And I hope you had a chance to coach indoors, not in the rain, so, which is what it is.
Rarely, which is why I've got a cold.
Yeah, we're showing that today. So the way we got here, I suppose, for the benefit of the audience, is we ran an in-person event back in October 23 called Culture Timebomb. There was some good attendance. A lot of people wanted to come but couldn't because of the timing. So we decided we'd do a recording and put it out there too. So if you came, here it is again as a healthy reminder and a helpful reminder, hopefully. If you wanted to come and didn't, here it is. So the format's changed a little bit. It's obviously slightly less interactive. There's no slide deck this time, but the principles and the content remains the same. And yeah, a great introduction for those of you that couldn't make it last time. So let's start. Gavin, let's talk about the phrase time bomb. It seems a bit scary, a bit alarmist. How do we get there?
Yeah, good question. So look, over the years, I've spoken to lots and lots of HR leaders, and I kept hearing the same I hear lots of stuff, right? But the same four things kept coming up. And one of the major ones was, and I'm paraphrasing here, but our leaders don't walk the talk, right? So there's a lot of lip service that we hear about, they pretend that they care, they nick someone else's model, and then they say all the right things and then they disappear. Or there's kind of like a lack of maturity in how our leaders approach that. So it could be a lot of skepticism or quite, let's say, traditional views of what culture is all about. And that, or maybe they've sunk loads of time or effort into previous efforts that they're not willing to sort of run the risk of losing that investment. So you get a huge piece around our leaders not walking the talk. But we also have on top of that employees who are just knackered, right? They're unwilling or unable to change. They've been through so much, right? I'm preaching to converted. Everyone knows they've been through so much. The pandemic, cost of living crisis, hybrid working, you've got to be more agile, more innovative, all those sorts of things. And so they're kind of overwhelmed, I think. The third one was typically HR are cobbler's children, right? We're being stretched, we're asked to do all these things. We've got to do more and more and more, but there are very little resources that are coming our way and very little additional help for us to be able to cope with that increased workload. And it's really hard to justify investing in your own team when all this other stuff's going on. And then the final thing, specifically when it comes to culture, is that there were no proven tools, techniques, models, methods, frameworks, no definition, no sort of measures or metrics that really helped those HR leaders take that story or take culture back out to their leadership team. And it was, particularly within this new world of work, the new normal that we're talking about, that was a real issue.
Oh, definitely. And I think what you said there, I think will resonate with every HR person I know. It feels like time's moved on, but certainly over the last 2-3 years, all we've been speaking about is the pressure, the reactive nature that HR's had to pick up and deal with these major issues. But like I say, I guess it's an obvious outcome, of the pandemic, hybrid working, cost of living crisis. A lot of budgets were diverted towards the things that businesses needed to survive. rather than thrive, perhaps. With everything else going on, some of these more, I mean, some would argue most definitely value add, but longer term vision activities have been put on the back burner. Doesn't mean to say it's going to necessarily blow up. What do you think?
Okay, well, I mean, obviously, part of the reason why I chose the phrase time bomb was as a result of not only having conversation with the HR leaders that I've had, the hundreds of HR leaders I've spoken to over the last few years, but I also get to speak to a lot of C-suite leaders. And there's almost like a discordance between what they're saying and what the HR community is saying. There's overlap and there's absolute alignment in some areas, but there's some really stark bits that need calling out, really, for me. So first off, when I speak to the CEO, and I speak to a lot across the C-suite, but a lot of COOs and CFOs as well as CEOs, there is a sense that actually culture is one of the most important things they can do. And that sort of feels at odds with what my HR colleagues are saying to me, which is this lack of engagement that they're getting. They're not walking the talk. They're actually saying, do you know what? It's really important. It regulates everything. We know it's a connection to customers. We know it's connection to employees. We know it's connection to candidates. We know all of those things. We also know it's key to agility, to innovation, to digitization, all those sorts of things. And we also know that when you get to a certain level of growth, those traditional methodologies, HR methodologies, you better say, just can't scale quickly enough. They don't enable us to be able to do that. And culture fills that void. So they know it's really, really important. But what they then turn around to me and say, but we don't know how to master it. We don't know how to get our heads around it. And more accurately, we don't think we're being helped by HR or people and culture to be able to do that, to really translate the commercial potential of culture. And let me just explain a little bit of what I've heard.
Okay.
Culture is often sort of too vague. It's too intangible for them to really sort of do the dotted line between commercial results and what they're doing, and what culture is doing. And that's sort of reinforced with the measures that we use, right? So I know a lot of people that measure culture based upon, or a lot of departments measure culture on, let's say, transactional metrics, or they might use something like an ENPS score, which on the surface of it seems okay, but those don't actually measure culture. They measure engagement, or they measure attrition, or they measure time to fill. They don't measure culture, and the C-suite knows that, right? They might not articulate it, but they've got this sort of sixth sense, which is that's fine, but that's not helping me sort of address those questions. And they know that even when the data is captured, it's not being used as effectively as it could be. I spoke to a CFO at a very well-known fast food outlet, who told me that he was doing a monthly culture survey. And he said, that's great, but nothing ever bloody happens with the data. Like, we do it every month. I don't know what happens to it. I'm totally disengaged from it. Yeah. And so there was a real frustration there. And then the other part of that was the sense that people are quite fickle. And I choose my words carefully here. I'm not talking about HR. I'm talking about employees. It's almost, I had a COO who said this to me, and it really stuck in my head. He said, look, I could do 6 months talking about nothing about culture. I could do 999 things that are absolutely perfect. But as soon as the reality of the business comes in, as soon as external market means I've got to shrink the business, people start pointing the finger and say, oh, you're not being honest. You're talking rubbish about culture. It's all a lie. And it isn't, right? There's a genuine sense from them that they're trying to do the best thing by the business. And so they feel that, it's almost too high risk. It's a bit scary for them to do it. And what that means is we end up in this horrible, vicious circle where senior leaders want to do much more about culture, but they don't, because they're not clear about, and they're not confident about how it drives the commercial performance or the commercial outcomes. So they don't focus on it as much, which, they sort of do one-off change projects. They might do a bit of corporate virtue signaling or a PR event or let's get culture in our performance metrics. But they're sort of playing around with the edges on it. So they never really get the evidence to get to grips with it, which means they never invest in their HR teams to actually engineer the change that's actually required, and then continue to treat them as service providers. And then on we go. So then those leaders aren't helped to actually invest in culture and see it for what it really is, deal with the issues, they kick the can down the road, and then kaboom, right? So that's a horribly long-winded way of me answering your question about the time bomb, which is because of that vicious circle. You've got things like, was it Revolut or the Met Police or Carillion or Patisserie Valerie, English Cricket Board, all of these, and those are just the ones I can think of in the last sort of couple of years or so, have all had explosions, right? The time bomb's gone off just because they've been kicking this culture can down the road.
There's a lot to think about there, isn't it? Where does that leave? So assuming HR probably agrees with you on all that, where does that leave them? How do we, what do we do now?
So I think HR, people and culture is in a really difficult position because of that. I think that they're actually, because I was in the function for 20 odd years, are disadvantaged as a result of that, right? So, we've got to establish these strong organizational culture. That's the expectation from our leadership. This is your job, right? But we don't have methods, frameworks, or tools, and no one's helping us buy those or invest in those or grow those ourselves. We need to guide senior leaders through some really difficult challenges, because a lot of the issues that we've got, back to the walk in the talk bit, a lot of them sit there within that group, but we're still seen as a service provider because we're kicking the can down the road and not investing in it properly. We need to demonstrate that culture contributes towards commercial success, but we're not measuring commercial success when we talk about culture. I see a lot of people measuring culture, but not measuring the impact of culture, which is a big issue. We've got to proactively drive improvements, but we don't have the money, time, or resources to be able to do that. And we need to do that with an employee community that's already skeptical and already tired. So it's a very difficult catch-22 position that HR finds itself in.
So, you make the point there. The budget probably not there, especially in the economic climate that we're experiencing. The resources aren't there as a result. The data may not be there in all cases. HR hasn't necessarily grasped the methodologies. So what can they do? How can, what can people take away from this where they can change everybody's mind when we're locked into this vicious circle, as you call it?
Yeah. So look, and that was why we ran the session a couple of months ago, and why we're doing it here is through the experience that I've had. I think there are 5 things that I'm never going to say they're free because that suggests that would be easier, right? But there are incredibly cost-effective and relatively easy to do that I think moves the needle, that changes the dynamic for HR or people and culture teams out there. And I keep coming back to this view that the culture journey has got lots of twists and turns in it, and you can't predict what it's going to be. Every organization is unique, every culture is unique. So there isn't a sort of playbook that do this and everything will be solved at the end of it. But what you can do is put some really basic things in place that will put you in the strongest possible position. And the first one of those is just clarity, right? Build confidence of your leadership team in particular, but your entire organization. Build confidence through clarity. And these are simple things like define what culture is. Now that sounds, sorry, I say it's simple things. That sounds like a simple thing, but there is so much conflict and confusion out there about what culture is. It's not as easy as me saying that, right? So, you've got the academics. They've come up with, I think there's 6 or 7 competing academic models that sit in there. You have all the different consultancies who have perfectly good models and tools of their own, but they're not all aligned to anyone else's. So it's really difficult to know exactly what it is. My answer here is it doesn't matter which one it is that you choose, but pick one, right? Yeah. Pick one and get a really clear definition of it. Move away from conflating the mechanisms that we use to define culture and actually focus specifically on it. And what I always recommend to people is they should look at there's a guy called Edgar Schein, and he came up with probably the only model that I know that most people, nearly everyone, agrees on, which was the 3 layers of culture. And sometimes it's often referred to as the culture iceberg, or it can be referred to as the culture iceberg. And what he said is that there's three layers. At the bottom, you've got your underlying assumptions and your beliefs that are conscious or unconscious. The next layer up is the norms and espoused values about appropriate values. And then at the top, normally above the water, is the artifacts that may reflect these. And artifacts can be a thing or a perception. And we take, artifacts are the visible things. You can see what's going on there. And what that model allows us to do is say, well, we know it's really difficult to underline or to surface underlying assumptions about beliefs. And there's a whole load of ambiguity that comes with cultural artifacts. So the best thing to do is go for the middle layer and just talk about norms and espoused values. And that is probably the clearest definition I would suggest anyone takes if you do nothing else, norms and espoused values, right? Because that just helps you understand and helps your organization understand what it is. By definition, then, you've got to talk about what it isn't. It's not engagement. Two sides of the same coin, but it is not engagement. Engagement is what happens between an individual and the organization. It's a one-to-one relationship almost, whereas culture happens between multiple people at multiple different layers. So it's a many-to-many, or peer-to-peer thing, right? You cannot use engagement measures for culture, just like you can't use culture measures for engagement. They operate very much, symbiotically. They will operate together, but they are different things. Nor is it public relations, right? From what I said earlier on about people are very skeptical and they're tired and they're knackered and they've got completely different expectations. PR or top-down comms isn't culture, right? It might help communicate the bits of culture you want, but in and of itself, it is not culture. Nor is talking about, ESG, nor is trying to get a software program, right, that facilitates it. We can't conflate the mechanisms with the actual discipline. And that's, I see where a lot of things go wrong. And I'm going to rush to the next two because I'm conscious that I'm rabbiting on a bit. But I think you also need to define how it works. And I talk about this constantly. I talk about culture being a practice, not a project, right? So I think I said this earlier on, organizations are like organisms, right? They are constantly evolving to the changing environments. They're uniquely adapted to the circumstances they find themselves in. So your culture is too. Your culture constantly evolves with you. So doing these sort of expensive, cradle to grave, one-off 12-month change programs, they're incredibly painful. They're incredibly slow. They're quite jarring, and they're kind of normally out of date by the time you launch, because your company is going to be different in a year's time by the time that you've actually launched whatever it is you thought of a year ago. And the other bit is that culture is emotional, not rational. Right, so connection comes from feeling, not telling. It comes from, or people aren't machines that can be programmed. And I think I see a lot of that. We say, we tell everyone what our values are, and people instantly know and live those values. It just doesn't work like that. So then, just banging on about those values, repeating those values constantly, or doing, corporate virtue signaling that signifies those values, it doesn't work, because with a skeptical audience that's looking for engagement, that's looking for meaning, that's looking for value and resonance, they can often become across as quite toxic. And then the final thing I'll say on this bit is about roles and ownership. I think you've got to define very clearly who does what in the organization. I did a piece of work for a client a year ago. We sat down with their teams and we redefined the role. We put four bands into their business. And we redefined the role of their senior executives. We redefined the role of their leadership. So their sort of C-suite -1, -2. We redefined the role of people in culture, their HR team, and we redefined the role of employees. And we gave everyone a sort of a set, clear path on, this is what you are now responsible and accountable to be able to do. And that really helped them kind of figure out, oh, I've got clarity on what my job is now, or the role that I need to play.
Okay. So bearing that in mind, then, with the four layers, how is HR's job different as a result?
Would I say different? I think it's evolved. So certainly from my perspective, HR has always had an accountability to be the steward of culture. But I think that there are, my organization has just added 3 extra layers, if you like, to sort of clarify that. So first off, I actually think HR are the engineers. And when I say engineer, what I mean by that is it's our job to build the scaffold or build the constructs that enable culture to thrive and survive and all those wonderful things. So that could be about codifying, clarifying, as I've just said, planning, designing. It could be about the frameworks. It could be about how work flows. It could be about channels to communicate. It could be about, I talk about campfire being the key way that we should be communicating culture within a business, is it's around a metaphorical campfire. It shouldn't be about channels going down. It shouldn't be about telling. It should be about sharing. So I see HR's role being very clear within that engineering space. I also think HR is an advocate. And what I mean by that is they should be the individuals at every conversation, which is making sure we're not forgetting the value of culture or the role that culture plays within that context. And that could vary from going to the C-suite and holding their feet to the flame and going, well, what's going to happen to the culture if you do X, Y, Z? How do we do this? All the way through to advocating how culture could actually limit the amount of work or limit the additional compliance that we need to put into an organization. We don't need to put more rules in. Our culture should deal with that, right? And obviously we shouldn't be putting rules in where we don't need them. Master is the third one. And again, that's almost back to the engineering bit, but it's about really knowing the subject, really knowing the topics and knowing what goes on. I think a lot of people talk about culture in a very sort of broad sense, but there's elements of anthropology into it. There's sociology, there's organizational psychology, there's a behavioral ecology that goes into all of it, right? So being the subject matter expert within those spaces, understanding those in enough detail to understand how humans interact, I actually think is a really critical path for HR. And then you add that on to the stewardship, which I think everyone is quite comfortable with, in how they sort of navigate and push that organization forward.
So there's still a lot to do for HR, as well as these other areas of the business. Anything else? I mean, anything else you think HR should do?
The one last thing I would say, probably the most important bit, is when we're talking about clarity, and this bit really is about clarity, is about defining, having an operating structure or a framework that is tangible and measurable. And we at Peppermoth, we have our own one, but there are others out there, right? So don't sort of suggest. I'm not suggesting there's only one solution to this, but I think that you've got to get to a point of actually moving away from this idea that culture is this sort of pink fluffy unicorn that people talk about in a sort of ethereal way, and actually make it much more tangible, make it much more real and much more measurable. And you need to make sure that it is measurable, because otherwise, how can you track your progress? How can you track if it's doing anything within your business?
Okay. So how important is it which tangible, measurable system, definition, model you use, or even how you measure it? I appreciate you've got your version, but what's the important thing when HR help sort of work?
As long as it measures culture, right? So I go back to the thing I said at the beginning, which is about norms and values. What is a social norm? Rather than measuring engagement, rather than measuring ENPS, rather than measuring I don't know, attrition or time to fill, right? As long as it measures culture and you're clear on what culture is, then it doesn't matter, right? And if you're comfortable, you might already have a supplier that does that for you. As long as you're comfortable that it does that, that's great. Use those. Don't change. Use those, because you've done a lot of the hard work. You're established. I think the emphasis I'd always put on is, with any model, is the emphasis is not on right or wrong per se. It's on utility, right? So it doesn't. As long as you can use it to make meaningful, constructive change in your business, that's the most important thing. It doesn't need to be perfect for you to be able to do that.
So you've got a model, whatever it is. Now what?
So the next thing I do, point number 2, if I'm doing my 5 top tips, tip number 2, I talk about personalizing the pain. So I've sat down with so many senior leaders over the years and heard them, presented almost like the McKinsey data and the PwC data and the Deloitte data, and this is what so-and-so says, and blah, blah, blah. And they sit there and they go, oh yeah, but that doesn't apply to us because we're different, right? I almost got to that point of going, it doesn't matter what you present, because you've got a set of bias that sits here, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute. But you've got a preconception about what culture is and how it operates that often acts as a barrier to that external data. So the external data, to a point, is limited in its effectiveness. It can help in some instances, but what I stress is focusing on internal data. So, and what I mean by that is, I recommend when I talk to organisations to start off with a pilot scheme, right? Because pilot schemes, it limits the risk, it limits the exposure, if you like, for the organisation, but it also gives you empirical evidence to actually validate your assumptions. Which is a fancy way of saying it's hard for them to say no, right? If you come up with evidence that it moves. If you come up with evidence that it doesn't move, it doesn't make any difference, well, then that's actually helpful in its own right. And maybe it's something you don't need to invest in. Either way, it's an effective use of your time. But to start off, capture your culture data from at least 2 comparable functions. So your pilot needs to have 2 functions, not 1, which is the mistake I see a lot of people do. Make sure you're measuring the right things, as I said. Then you also need to make sure that you're capturing the financial, or the commercial data, all those same 2 functions. Now you should already be, or your CFO, your COO should already be capturing all of that. Excuse me. So you should have most of that data already. But what that does is it gives you a baseline. Here is what our current culture data and our current commercial baseline for function A, and here's our current commercial data and culture data for function B. And then you run the pilot scheme with one of those functions, using the other one as the test group. And without that control group, it's very hard to be able to turn around to a leadership team or anyone in the business and say, actually, culture adds value or not, because it's easy for them to dismiss the data unless it's their data, unless they're feeling that actual pain or gain themselves. And so doing that with the control group enables you to do a compare and contrast. Now, you need enough time for that pilot study to take effect, and I would say at least 3 months. But that does limit your exposure, limit the risk, but come out with that empirical data that is actually often missing in most of the culture conversations that I have.
It's interesting. I mean, I appreciate there's a wide audience out there with very, very different sized businesses, and some of the larger blue chips, I can see them being very, very receptive to these concepts and these methods. There's also probably a firm with 200 people and 2 HR people in it. Often, particularly in that scenario, you'll see senior leaders, CEOs resist. They've got an idea in their head, and they'll overrule perhaps some of this control group evidence and do what they want regardless. What do you think? Does it really work?
That does happen, absolutely. And I think data is part of the story. But, and I alluded to this beforehand when I talked about the bias that people have. We often make the mistake, and I'm guilty of this myself back in my earlier corporate days, is we sort of jump ahead, right? So you'll start off on an initiative and you'll go, oh, well, I've got my budget signed off to do XYZ project. We assume leaders are all on board with that, right? Everyone gets it. Okay, well, the CEO's agreed to do it, so everyone must be aligned. And off we go, and they'll play along and say the right things, and they'll do the right stuff. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to draw attention to themselves if the CEO said X, Y, Z. But whilst they might be whilst they're thinking rationally, right, this is I better keep my head down, I don't want to get in trouble. How they actually behave, what they'll do in real life, will be emotional. Okay. And many will resist. And that's exactly the point I think you're making, maybe also with the top end as opposed to the sort of C-suite level. But you get a lot of individuals who will understand the logic of culture, but will not change their behavior because of their emotional attachment to their previous experiences. And again, I'm not going to bore you with the psychology there, but I talk about building ownership through constructive conflict, because you'll have these individuals who will have built up these images, these preconceptions, these biases, these safety nets really for themselves about what culture is. And it doesn't matter what evidence you've produced at that point, whether you've got real data or not, that doesn't cut through. They'll still be quite resistant to that. And so you've got to sit down and kind of work through those with them. And what I recommend is you find the key leaders within any change program that you want to do. If it's C-suite, or it could be key influencers in your business, and you have to sit down and target those individuals. You have to listen to them first, and listen to them without judgment, right? So you need to understand why they feel the way they feel about culture, and allow and acknowledge and recognize that they were right to do that. But then you've got to ask the question, all right, but in today's sense, are you right to do all of those sorts of things? But in today's world, does that still make sense? Does that still work for you? Right? You know, you're sitting here, your CEO's asked you to go on this culture journey, you're pushing back as much as you possibly can. How does that help you? Right? Does it still make sense to have this preconception or this behavior pattern that stops you from doing that? And it's one of those sort of odd things, is that actually constructive change normally starts with conflict, because you can't address that until that individual's been through their own sort of process of logically, of emotionally addressing their blockers. And that does have to happen on an individual basis. So that can be time consuming, but it's absolutely critical. But then after that, you've got to set leaders up for success. You can't just sort of go, oh, you've broken through, you've had your epiphany, off you go. You've got to then help them go on that journey, because they won't know how to. Right? They'll be right at the beginning. So there will be a bit of hand-holding at the beginning to allow them to sort of grow into that new space.
Okay, I understand. So assuming you've targeted these individual leaders who may be a challenge, and blockers, you've got them on board. What we're going to do now is run some experiments, which sounds complex, long-winded, slow, expensive. I mean, how can HR go about this?
It doesn't need to be any of those things. So it's one of those, when we talk about change, I think everyone has this sort of mental image where when you talk about change management, it's normally a large consultancy coming in, everyone with clipboards, and it's sort of quite confronting, and it's quite sort of aggressive almost. And I think there's this sense that change is always painful, it's always negative. And look, we're pre-programmed as human beings. We are programmed to not like change, all to do with our hunter-gatherer brains. Again, I'm not going to go into it now, don't have time, but we're pre-programmed not to like it. And so when we've got this mental image that pops up in our head, which is, I've got all these suits coming in and it's going to be a nightmare and it's going to just be pain for the next 12 months. Of course you're going to push back. But for me, change should be small. It should be fast, and it should be quite specific. I talk about small, fast, focused, and frequent are the sort of the sort of soundbar I use. Because change should be an iterative process. It's not a start-stop. It's constant. And back to this evolution thing. If culture is a practice, not a project, and organizations constantly evolve, then change, or your culture constantly evolve. So there's no end point to it. But therefore, doing a big change program with a big end point, it'll be good when we get there, is nonsense, right? You've got to do small changes constantly and embed that into your business to allow you to adapt and evolve with your changing business context and circumstance. So, and in that sense, change and then testing, the experimentation, can be really small and really cheap and really fast. So one of the things I often do is I'm a big fan of something called paper prototypes. And a paper prototype is just a fancy way of drawing something out, a visual representation of what you think, and putting it in front of someone and going, what do you think? It's not expensive, right? And you can get immediate feedback of, that's not going to work. Oh, I like that bit. I hate that bit. And immediately you've got some feedback there that enables you to go, okay, that's interesting. So we like these bits, don't like those bits. Let's do another paper prototype based upon that. And I'm being a bit pithy here, but it does not need to be complicated. I mean, there's another one, card sorting, which is a good one, which is, if you're looking for someone to prioritize what's most important to them, you get however many cards you need, and this could be a digital card deck as much as a physical one, and they just sort the cards as to what's the most important thing. These are simple ideas that actually help you kind of evolve. Okay, what changes should I be making in my organization? I know it could work in this way because that's the real-time feedback I'm getting. And of course, you could increase the strength of your evidence by doing more tests. But I'd always say at the beginning, if you're at the beginning of this journey, cheap and cheerful, right? As easy as it can be to give you that immediate information to then start sort of refining your approach, knowing that your approach is always going to be refined based upon the feedback loops that you build.
Okay. So it doesn't have to cost the earth. We still got the issue of resource in terms of people. You know, HR, they're dealing with site strategy, hybrid, agile working, EVP, war for talent, candidate attraction, retention. You know, the list is relentless and endless. How do HR leaders roll this stuff out when their teams are already overstretched?
So this is where I think it's about the power of grassroots. And let me explain what I mean by that. I think that, again, it's back to this analogy about change, where we see change as being sort of big and scary because it's being done to us, right? We've lost control, right? The men with a clipboard are coming in and going to tell us how it's going to be. And that's just part of the reason why people resist it so much, is because of the fear of the unknown, fear of loss. And so if you just change that equation and go, well, actually, if you liberate your employees to come up with the solutions that they want to do and they want to succeed, not only do you have more people doing it, but they're also far more effective and far more engaged when those solutions come into play. And so I think the key thing here is not necessarily leveraging HR to do it. I think it's leveraging your employees to do it. And so I would suggest going to your organization and finding out, I mean, if you've got a leadership cadre, or if you've got a graduate cadre, or anything similar, where there are individuals that are already, let's say, engaged with the idea of supporting the business, and you actually leverage their intellect, because most organizations already have they've got enough intellectual firepower already. They don't need to buy external consultants, which might sound like sacrilege from someone who used to be a consultant. But you don't need to buy those external consultants to come in. You've already got the intellectual firepower. What you need is to help point them in the right direction, and then give them the freedom to go off and do what they're capable of doing. And so, let me give you an analogy. So what I saw, there's a company that I've worked with, two companies I work with actually, but where managers tended to notice an idea when their employees took a hold of it, and they'd ignored it up until the point when they dismissed it, specifically about culture. They'd ignored it until the employees turned around and went, no, this is really important to us, and we're going to solve this problem. And they went off and they turned around to those they just went off and did it. And the C-suite turned around and went, hang on a second, this is quite good, because they ended up solving a problem that the C-suite knew they had, but it didn't cost them anything, and they didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to make any decisions, right? C-suite turned around and went, the business has solved a problem for me. What's not to like? They also managed to produce evidence that it qualifies the change, but they have this sense of ownership and this sense of self-determination because they'd come up with the idea themselves. And that was incredibly powerful. And then I'll give you another example where I worked with an engineering business just this summer gone. And they had an issue about communicating, right? So there was a lot of top-down communication about culture, and the organization was feeling very disempowered and very disengaged with there's no conversations going on here. So we had one group that turned around and went, okay, instead of you just sending us emails about telling us what's going to happen, we're going to invite our manager in, and we're going to have a sort of fortnightly, I think it was, a fortnightly conference where we'll come together in person, and we'll just spend 2 hours talking about all the things that corporate are talking about. And they loved it. And that sent ripples throughout the business, because everyone else started to hear they were doing it and how much more effective it was. And eventually it got up to the CEO, and the CEO couldn't say no to other people saying, can we do the same? Because everyone was liking it so much, and it had spread organically across the business. So look, again, you're talking about this grassroots, occasionally I call it guerrilla culture, UERRILLA, not with an O, where people are actually sort of doing this very fast hit, immediate, very tactical culture change themselves, that actually becomes collectively starts to build some real momentum.
Well, I know that's point 5. So this is a great time for me to say, summarize these 5 tips. So taking people back to the beginning, HR is struggling, that we know that culture transformation needs to take place. but do we know what culture is, and how do we go about this? So yeah, summarize what you've mentioned, which can help break the vicious cycle and is cheap, quick, free, easy.
Cheaper, quicker, freer. But yes, yeah, I'll do my best.
Do your best.
Number one, build confidence through clarity, right? So be clear on what your definitions are. Just pick a definition, make sure it's about culture, stick to it, make sure everyone else sticks to it. Don't confuse it with other things, right? Don't confuse it with engagement, don't confuse it with CSR. Be clear on what culture is and make sure everyone is on the same page. Build credibility with commercial evidence. So your commercial data is there already. Get your culture data, compare the two through focus groups, right? So build that credibility with commercial evidence. 3, build ownership with or through individuals first. Change is emotional, not necessarily rational. It starts off with emotions, and there will always be individuals there, rightly or wrongly, who have preconceptions or bias. Address those first before you can address the rest of it. And not everyone, but the key stakeholders that are going to make the difference between your success and failure when it comes to culture. 4, build traction with a minimal viable solution. Start small, go fast, quick and dirty, right? And number 5, build momentum from the bottom up. This guerrilla culture, the employee-led culture. If you engage your employees effectively, and there will people out there that absolutely are passionate about this, that will want to do this, that will invest time on this without coming out of your cost center or your budget. If you've got that, leverage it, and that can make a huge difference.
Amazing. Hey, thank you so much for doing this again. We've done it at the front of a room. No, we've done it in front of a telly or screen. Telly in my house. And I just wanted to say, thanks so much for your time. It's always a pleasure talking to Gavin Russell from Moth, particularly around culture transformation. I think that this is at least the 3rd one we've done. So it's
over the years, 2 or 3, 4, maybe
at least one a year.
At least.
Exactly. But thanks for your time as always. And obviously, if people are interested and want to find out more, they can reach out to you. LinkedIn is probably one of the easiest ways, I'm guessing.
Yeah. I presume I'll be, when the video goes out, my name will be tagged, but you can email me at gavin@peppermoth.live or just go on the website, peppermoth.live, and you can contact me there.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us again, Gavin. Cheers.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Thanks for watching or listening. Episode 15, would you believe, of Talk HR UK Season 2. Thanks for enjoying Gavin Russell's Culture Timebomb. Hopefully you found some useful steps to take from there. All other episodes of Talk HR are available on YouTube, on Apple, on Spotify, and I publicise them regularly on LinkedIn. Do like and subscribe. As always, I'm Simon Gear from Alexander Lloyd's HR Recruitment team. Great to speak to you all, and look forward to speaking to you again next time. Many thanks.